Let's wait a couple more minutes and then start.
Yep.
I think we can start.
Yep, sure.
So, hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar with Ken Pugh. Ken Pugh, if you don't know him, is one of the leading BDD trainers, and today he will coach us how to effectively practice BDD. My name is Katerina Gazichuk. I'm social media, content and community manager at SpecFlow, and today I will moderate this session. So it's a role play style webinar. So each member of our team will represent a particular role. However, Matthias and Andy couldn't make it today due to unexpected circumstances. So Ken, Jordan, and I will do the webinar together. I hope for your understanding. And so today for this webinar, we will use such tools as Muir, SpecFlow, Gherkin Editor, and Visual Studio. And if you have any question, please use our Q&A tool for questions. Upload questions that are interesting for you. All the questions will be answered at the dedicated Q&A sessions at the end. And of course, we will have a 5-minute break after the first hours. Tomorrow you will receive certificates and recording of both sessions. And let's start. So I stop my sharing. Share.
And I'll just pin Ken. There we go.
Cool. Hi there. Morning. So before we start today, why don't we just do a little review of what we did yesterday? Can you bring the mural board up? for a moment and just throw that onto the screen.
1 minute. I'll share my screen.
What we did yesterday is it's coming up. Let's see, as we, go up to the top a little bit and also zoom it up a little bit so that people can actually, yeah, there we go. And farther up to the top. And as you can see, this was the, this is just the workflow and the story that we were working on. There was already the ability to bring up suggestions for a single file. And the story you see on the right was to bring up suggestions for multiple files. So if you own multiple files, you start to type in a step def, and it will bring up suggestions that appear in multiple files. So come down a little bit to the next, the context diagram. The context diagram, we showed what our process and what external things this process talks to, i.e. there's an authenticator to make sure you're logged on. We have storage for the feature files, and we have the ability to download a file that can be shipped out. And so this gives us an idea of, if we're automating things, what potential test doubles we need. A test double for an authenticator, so we aren't always bothering our authentication process or Microsoft. And maybe a feature file, maybe we need a test double or not, but to have some storage that we have complete control over. And scroll down to the next one. And this was our flow. This is the flow of how a user would use the system. Now, it looks a linear flow, but there can be circular feedback and loopbacks and everything in this flow. So the user has opened up a Gherkin editor and they're modifying their feature file. And that's where this scenario comes into play that we're talking about, that we're going to be able to, as they're typing away, we're going to say, hey, here are other steps that utilize that same text that you just typed. Do you want to reuse that step text? And now to the bottom, to the as we did a little discovery yesterday, and we won't go over all of them, but come on up just a little bit down, but yeah, a few more. Yep. So we've got how many suggestions? Well, we're not going to change the current behavior. We are going to remove any duplicate steps. So if a step appeared in 2 files, we're just going to say that we're only going to show one of them. And then just scroll up one more. Just one more, couple. There we go. So that how are the steps sorted? Well, we're getting steps from multiple files, and our product owner says, sort them by the current file, the matches in the current file first, then the matches in the other file. And then within each of those 2 blocks, the blocks should be sorted alphabetically. So that's where we are. And now we're going to start actually writing the scenarios. Thank you. Thank you.
Cool. You ready for me to share, Ken, or is there a bit you need to do before?
Nope. I've got just a couple of more words to put on here.
No worries.
Okay. So, a little bit of flow. So we have our flow scenario. Given the current state or the conditions, when an action or an event occurs, then we're either going to get a new state or we're going to get an output. So a state, action, and a new state. Yesterday, we talked about business rules, which simply have an input and output. We're going to hit those again shortly and show some examples there. So here's for the flow, the behavior for flow. We set up the current state, we trigger some action or event on it, and then we assert, i.e. then we say, here's what we expect. So given a current state, we do an action or an event occurs and we get a new state and or we get some output. So the scenario that we started with yesterday, given our car is not moving, when we press the accelerator, then 60 miles or 100 kilometers per hour is reached before 3 seconds. That was the one Jordan came up with. So 60 miles per hour is reached before in 3 seconds. There's our scenario. That's the way Jordan wanted the car to work. And now what's our test for this scenario? Given our current state, we're not moving. When we trigger it, then we check that our actual result is equal to our expected results. So we've got a current state not moving, an action event pushing the accelerator, and our new state is acceleration. So therefore, then our test is simply, given we're not moving, we press the accelerator and we check that 60 miles per hour is reached before 3 seconds. Oh, we have a second then. During this time, we also have to hear because Jordan wanted to have some noise. Do we want that second part of the then, that noise, to be with this scenario or have it as a separate scenario? Well, we've got the same given and the same when. We can have two thens that say we need to have it both accelerate and it has to make noise. If you wish, you can separate these into two. Perfectly fine to keep them in one because it's the same given and the same when. So here's an outline of the flow. Yesterday, we talked about converting temperatures. And then I showed our flow was taking a report, converting all the temperatures in the report from Celsius to Fahrenheit and outputting the report. So if we looked at this in just the flow sequence, our user gets to set a temperature setting, either Fahrenheit or Celsius. When his report is received with the temperature in Celsius, then the report gets sent out and every Celsius temperature gets converted to Fahrenheit. That's our flow. Well, let's add some values to this. We can do it two ways. We can put them in line or in tables. So if we do it in line, we have given the temperature setting as Fahrenheit, a report's received with 100 degrees in Celsius in it, then the report gets sent out with 212 in Fahrenheit. Well, that's some inline values. In fact, many Gherkin scenarios you see use inline values, but we could instead use tables, step-def tables that then start to talk about the domain terms, i.e., we talk about a domain term measure, and we call it Fahrenheit or Celsius. Then when a report is received containing some value that's in the measure of Celsius, we convert it to a value 212 with a measure in Fahrenheit. So now by splitting this out into tables, we start to identify our domain terms and understanding and collaborating on the meaning of those domain terms is an important thing in understanding what your problem is. Here's one way we can do it with tables. Well, so let me ask this. We're going to have a little poll here. Which way do you prefer? Which way do you do things? Do you have your values inline? Do most all of your scenarios inline and you like it that way? Do you have scenarios mostly in tables and you like it that way? Or do you sort of switch between tables and inline? So I'll just give you 5 seconds to answer this poll. Okay, let's see what the answers are, what our results are. Oh, we are table oriented. Half of the people like tables. We have about half, all depends, and there's a few that like have the values in line. I go either way, but I have to say that my preference in the way that I teach and coach is using tables, because tables tend to help you point out what are the domain terms. And so I always say, if we're collaborating with business, we speak the language of business. And as I said yesterday, what's the language of business? Excel. And so the tables are the language of business. Not necessarily all the time. As I always say, there are exceptions. All right. So now let's look at the scenarios. In this case, the scenarios, it turns out, sometimes you're always from a new greenfield. And so you just start creating scenarios that are greenfield scenarios, i.e. you just come up with something. But in this case, what we have is we are modifying an existing feature. Well, whenever you're modifying an existing feature, you need to go and find all the scenarios against that feature, because either they're going to remain the same, some of them, and some of them, because you're modifying it, they're going to be different. So we're going to show first our scenarios that exist for the current configuration, and then since we're missing two members, I am going to join the triad and be both a consultant and a contributor, and we'll see how these scenarios get modified when we go to multiple files. All right, bring it up, Jordan.
Yep, it's on its way. Let me know when you can see.
Okay, maybe if you can just zoom it up just a little bit for the people who might have. Okay,
all right?
That's a good size.
Okay, cool. So I guess for everyone that hasn't seen it, well, nobody's seen it, but I'll just talk about it a little bit. So this is the existing feature file we have for the ordering for the auto completion. So you can see here we've got this this background section here, and this given the current file contains these steps. When typing something, then the suggestions are presented, and then we have a table for suggestions, and then we've got various other scenarios that cover the requirements for the matching. So that's what we've got currently, and obviously we've been talking about the next iteration of the matching, and particularly ordering by alphabetical. So we need to, I guess, update this this particular scenario, so it includes that eventuality. So
okay, so I'm going to make a suggestion here, because people might want to do this. Can we copy this into a separate file and share a read-only tag on that file, and people can then, and we'll put it in the chat, and if people want to, they can look at what the existing scenarios are, and if you want, you can try them out. Anyone with the link?
Oh yeah, can view. Sorry, yes.
Yeah,
I'll post it in the chat here. There we go. It's in the chat now. So
now you can see what we're working with. Okay.
Cool. Good stuff. So let's review again. So we've got our background, and that's our given for our I guess our start state that's relevant for the other scenarios. So I guess this needs to change now, right, Ken? Because we're talking about one file as opposed to multiple files, right?
Yeah. So as a simple way, what I'd simply suggest is we break this into a given one file contains, and we'll take that first and just have that first scenario. And then, yeah, end up the quote, and then and our current file contains. Okay, so what have we simply done? We've taken an existing thing that said the steps are all in one, the scenarios are all in one file, and we put them into two files. So we've got our current file, which has the scenario outline in it, and this one file that contains the one that just has the specific numbers in it. So let's see how that's going to change. Come on down to our character typing here. All right. So now, here is the way the suggestions were presented when the scenarios were all in one file. How is this going to change since now those last two scenarios, or those two lines actually came from the current file? This is where we need our product owner to be in here. But since I'm at least a little familiar with this, let's take those lines 35 and 36 and put them up to 33. And just
see if I can just shoehorn them in there.
Right. Okay. Now, looks like they're sorted alphabetically, and the stuff that is in the current file is now listed first. Now here's a cute little thing that I like to do, because some people say, Ken, that's nice, but I don't really understand. So after on 32, after suggestion, put notes. And now on the next line after 33, put from current file. And the next would be from current file. And the next would be from one file or other file, whatever.
Yeah, I think other might be better.
Jordan, can you please zoom out a bit? I got a comment in the chat.
Zoom out. Okay,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, is that better? Let us know.
Zoom out.
I think we went a bit
Okay.
too far in.
Okay, we have different perspectives on viewing. So what do we have here? We now show what our suggestion should be. And then, because if somebody's really reading this, because remember, we write this once and read it multiple times, why don't we just say what we meant? i.e., that came from the current file. Okay. And the other ones came from the other file. Oh, that's why those appeared first. And now we have our scenario on line 38. Well, 38 doesn't change because we have our 4 suggestions. If we want, we can flip the sequence around to match, but it's the same 4 suggestions. So it depends whether you'd like to just flip that. The rest of the everything stays the same. I like to tend sometimes to go, if that was my given from the output of the one scenario, I sort of like to have a match with the second one. It's not required. So I would simply take 43 and 44 and put them on 41.
And I guess we could extend with the notes, right?
And you could extend, but in this case, the notes are there because that was why we put them in that sequence. Here, we're not concerned with with the reason for the sequencing. We're just saying this is what we got. So
And we
yeah.
just want the output to be the input
Yes.
of the next, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And so now, we have one more. And let's come up back to line, okay. Yeah, so line 50, so let's do the scenario on 52.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is actually a little repetitive from the scenario, the previous one. That was matching the steps for the when. This is showing that we can also match the steps for the then. Okay, so the question is, which way should this be? Is this repetitive? Maybe, maybe not. We want to make sure that this suggestions work for the given, the when, and the then. Well, so we could have at least the then part, maybe we could have a given part. And so it looks like this sequence is the same. Maybe we actually had the wrong order on 60 and 61. Maybe we had the wrong order the last time, but it still worked because they were just testing to see things. Okay, so now we have, and we're going to talk about our business rules in the next section. But let me ask for any questions in the comments before we move along here. And notice, if you take the if you copy the link, you can actually go against the existing implementation and see that it matches. In fact, that's why we utilize the background that we did. It's the one that automatically comes up as your initial file. Okay, and notice you will not be able to see suggestions unless you're logged in. Okay. Any questions with anything in the comments that
I don't see anything. Why? Someone's asked, why are we shuffling the lines?
Oh, why are we shuffling the lines? Because the rule was that we should show the current file first, followed by the other files. And so on the first and the second, that actually comes from the current file. The background is what's giving us a given, okay? And so the preconditions, in fact, we are using exactly the same background, the given, for both of these other scenarios. So that we don't need a given for that.
There's one other question here. In the scenario when typing, so that's the name of the first step at least. Okay, didn't spot. Okay, it was just about the background. Cool. So it looks like Andrew's happy as well. So
okay.
Yeah.
Now, if we were starting this from scratch, we might not have that as a background. We could have that as a given in one scenario, and then you're saying, I'm doing the matching for the whens. Oh, I want to do the matching for the thens. Do I want to start with the same, sort of the same base? Yeah. As soon as you hit copy and paste, think about using a background. And in this case, it works pretty well because that background matches exactly what our data is on the screen. And we're simply doing 3 different scenarios against that same thing. All right. Now, that background was created from the actual example itself, the example that comes up with the Gherkin editor. For testers, you might go, I don't like the way that background is written. Let me play around with it more. Oh, I want to have a different givens on things, or I want to have 4 different types of givens and 2 different texts for when and so forth. Perfectly fine. Create your, in fact, you can create, this is, I'll call it the understanding test. Then you could create your own separate test that have all the different combinations of given and whens in there, and utilize exactly the same automation that is utilized for these tests. Okay. So I look at Gherkin as being, here's our understanding test that we agree how it works, and then we can take and change the data a bit and have multiple variations, if you will, of all that stuff. Okay. Thank you. So now, let's talk about domain terms and business rules. These are my favorite things, because business rules and the calculations I mentioned yesterday. Well, our flow that we just did is one shade of Gherkin. We need to set up something. We do something and we get an output. We had to have some scenarios in a file. Then when we did some typing, then we got the matches. And so those are stateful. However, business rules and domain terms are different shades, as I call it. Input and output. Nothing to set up, completely stateless. And these are the easiest things to automate because they typically will just go against a single method or single component in the actual implementation. But we want to document them and test them because of all those variations, just like we showed with the temperature. And basically it looks like, given some inputs, when the calculation is performed, then this is the output. So here's our input values. We run a rule, and this is what we expect for our output. Pretty straightforward. An input a value, run a calculation, and get some value out. And then what's our test? We simply assert that what we got is what we expected. Simple. So here was our business rule from before. Input is in Celsius, output is in Fahrenheit. There's our input, those are our outputs. And I always like to have a notes column. Why is that? So let me just break off here for one more comment. You could separate this out into multiple scenarios. You could have a scenario about digits of precision. You could have a scenario about minimum and above minimum, so forth. The alternative is simply let's have just one scenario and we note what we are actually testing here, or the rule or the portion of the rule that we are working on. A little more compact, easier to read. If we had separate scenarios, think of how many lines we'd have to read. And by the time we got to the 5th scenario, you'd forgotten what the first is. So this is why I prefer the compact form. I also prefer the compact form. Notice that we only have a single step in here. In fact, it's an anonymous step. It could be a given when then. It doesn't really matter. But if you use that for your business rules, that immediately points out to the reader, this is a simple input-output process. This is not a we need to set something up process. So that's why business rules and calculations, I use this form for. Okay, so we have the given, when, then in there. So the question now is, given all this, How many examples do we need? Well, this is where we differentiate between understanding and completeness. So you got some, just enough for understanding. A complete, we do all the standard test checks, i.e. minimum, maximum, and so forth, bad characters. And then combinations for exhaustive testing. So we've got our table there, Celsius, Fahrenheit. Yeah, we want to make sure that the formula is correct. Yeah, we want to make sure that our precision is correct. Yeah, we want to make sure that our minimum is noted as an error, so forth. Now, and if we had a maximum of 500, we do something like that. So now we have enough for understanding. And it's fairly well complete. But combinations, that's up to you. Since half of you are testers, test away. You can include them in the same scenario. You can simply include them in a separate scenario with a tag on top that says, here's my comprehensive test. I am going to test every temperature between minus 300 to positive 600 and every decimal in between. I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm just saying, if this was such a critical thing that if any of those values were wrong, then do it. But the beauty is that if you've got things set up and automated for the standard stuff, it works for all your combinations. And you can simply run through them all. Okay. So you can split them up, tag them for run all the time as your normal smoke build, or run it overnight because we want to check all of those values. And you can simply do that using the tags. So now we also have, as I showed before, this scenario. That business rule for the conversion gets used in the flow scenario. In fact, most flow scenarios incorporate multiple business rules. You don't want to test the business rule in the flow because all of a sudden you're having to do copy and pasting, copy and pasting, copy and pasting. Or even if you do a scenario outline, it sometimes becomes confusing. Are you testing a flow? Are you testing a business rule? So separating them out makes things a lot simpler. So here's our business rule. Here's another way we could done our flow test. When a report is received, the contents contain this, and now when we send it out, the contents should be that. Okay. We had our business rule conversion. We actually now have the text itself. And to show an example of the text in that is how it's used. So we have our business rule. Now, how about domain terms? Domain term scenario. The valid values for domain terms. Now you can look at it saying, given a value for domain term, when it's checked, is a valid value, valid or not. Okay, that's the long form of it. But let's give an example of this. Suppose that we actually had a domain term Celsius temperature. Now we could have temperature with a variation of Celsius and Fahrenheit, but let's just talk about Celsius. We're going to have values and perhaps formatted values that have particular characters after it. Okay? And so now, excuse me. So now in these values, we are going to say, what are valid Celsius values? Well, we're going to say it requires a C because we don't know if it's Celsius unless there's a C on there. Okay, so that's valid. Well, yep, we're allowing allowing 2 decimal digits in our term. Oh, that's 3 decimal digits. We've declared that a temperature can only have 2 decimal digits, so that's not valid. Oh, that's not a valid Celsius. And if we decided that we had a 500 maximum, that would be too high. Oh, and now if we don't have a C on it, we don't consider it valid. So a domain term, we have, here are the valid representations that we might input in a text from the screen, from a web service, from a file, anywhere else. We just say these are the valid representations. And should we construct that object? Should we throw an error? That's now a programmer or a design issue. And on the other hand, we could also have a domain term that says, here's the way that we will output our representations, that we will always output it with 2 decimal digits, or a 0 if there are no decimals, just simply an integer value if there are no decimals afterwards. But all of these things are visible to the user. They are all important to the business, and therefore, that's why you want to create your domain terms. And then all you have to do is talk about the domain term Celsius. You don't have to worry about all the values, valid or not. They're just all contained. We've already determined and decided upon what are valid values. So we're going to have 2 things in here. We're going to write a domain term scenario, and we're going to write a business rule scenario. Now, it turns out in our exercise here, we really don't have a domain term. Okay, you maybe have the term called match, but that's not much to it. But so we're going to just start with our business rule scenarios. And I think that Jordan has an example of a domain term we called email address. And I'm just bringing this on him, that we had from a previous exercise. But let's take a look at our domain term scenarios. All right, can you bring up our original? Okay.
You want me to find the original one? Yeah.
No, I think this is good. Nope, this is
Okay.
good.
Okay.
Yeah, because we're just going to alter this one.
Sure.
Okay. So on line 61. On line 61 is a business rule. And what this business rule says is, when I type this word, what text should be matched? So in other words, this now is going to be utilized and has been utilized in the previous flow steps. So if I type V, yeah, it's going to match the result. I don't have to start with the V. I can just type result and it'll match that. Or I can type stream and it will match the same line because stream appears. And then we have result stream. Well, because you can't always remember what these things are, and especially if you had a lot of matching steps. So that'll match. Result should be on 120 on the screen. Now, what else could we have in here? What else kind of matches? Well, we could say if I type stream result, should that be a match or not? Because the words appear, but it's not in the same sequence. What do you think, Jordan? Katrina?
I think so. I think so.
Good. Well, give us another line then. You can copy that line and just
flip them about.
Yeah. I'm okay with copy and paste as long as it's only a single line.
Yeah.
Okay. Now this, it turns out, is not the way the system works. So if currently now, so if you said, well, Ken, you had a business rule and it doesn't work that way. Well, what we have here is we've had an existing scenario for the business rule for matching, and you go, we're going to make a change. There we go. We've just made that change. Now, the key is, if we have this business rule like this, how many different flow scenarios that we did before do we have to do? Well, we've already said that it matches here. We've already utilized the V part. Do we need to test it for all the other possibilities? Do we need to have, given all these scenarios, when I type result screen, then these should be the suggestions? No. If it was critical, yes, but for the most part, we've shown that the flow works, and now all we're doing is testing the actual matching. And so we have one more scenario, it turns out, and just give me a new line. Yeah, give me one more line in 71, just so you can copy 70 down, and we'll just.
You want me to copy this down or this line?
No, just that last line. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, change it back to result screen for the moment. And just, yeah, that line. And now, if you type an A between result and screen, so over at the first line, no, at the first column in the typing, type an A in there. Okay.
Oh, like that.
Like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, yeah. Well, it turns out that this is actually the way the system works, is they ignore a single A. Because it figures that you're going to type an A in there, and if the word is a V, it's like it won't do any matching. And so A's get ignored. And so in fact, we would have in the notes on that line, we'd say the word A gets ignored.
Single, no single.
Okay. So there's our business rule. All right. Let's come down with another one down here on, scroll up on, 73. Now here is the order of suggestions. All right. This business, we had maybe we didn't have a default order for suggestions before, or maybe we did. And that said that I want, if these are my suggestions, I want them in this order for some reason. Well, maybe we didn't need the separate business rule for a single file. But now, having this business rule, and it looks slightly different because we have to have a whole table of data that we're going to create a table of data with. But it's still just an input-output. So let's come back to on 75, line 75. Give me a column called appears in. And the next line, that will be file 1.
Oh, yeah, I'm with you. Oh.
And then file 1.
File 2?
Yeah. No, a current file. The one we're working on.
Forget how we named it in the earlier
Yeah,
slide.
I think we just called it current file. But I know that we didn't do FIFO. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And then that will be the sequence at the bottom. Okay. And we can, of course, also say we could put notes on there as well.
Mhm.
Okay. So although we sort of showed this output of in the flow, we might want to detail it in here. So in fact, put a notes on line 62, put a notes column, and just it will, in fact, you can let's put the notes column in rather than do a copy and paste the notes column, and then just say current file appears first, or current is first.
Mhm.
And the next one, oh, we missed one. Okay, and then and we need to have, oh, hold it. I apologize. On line 62, give me a new line and put.
Oh, this one. Sorry.
I need to have a suggestion. No, I'm sorry. Yeah.
What are we doing? Oh, you mean...
Okay. On 62, give me a new line after 62. Oh, no, I'm sorry, 82. I apologize. 80.
Yeah.
82.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Fran, text our suggestion. Type suggestion. No, suggestion. And then quote, and then type notes.
Okay.
Okay. And then then the notes will be current. Yep.
Yep.
And then current is first and so forth. Yep.
Mhm. Other.
Yeah, other file.
There we go. We got there at the end.
There we go. All right. This is a wonderful scenario. This is a simple thing to understand. It doesn't, we're not having to look in some text to parse it. This assumes that we parsed it, we figured out our list of matches, and now this scenario is just about sorting them as how they appear on the screen. Now, once again, this scenario is actually utilized in the flow scenario because it actually, that's the sequence. But without having to create another flow scenario, and we're just going to do this in this one, just to show an example, copy line 77 and put it after line 79. And then copy line 79 and put it after 80. And then change the appears in on 80 and 81 to file 2. And the next one to file 2. All right. Now my question to you is that the way the scenario should work?
I wouldn't have thought so. I would like them to, current file, then maybe file 1, then file 2.
Okay. So, but our product owner Andy isn't here, so we have to make a decision, and then of course it will be incorrect when he comes back.
Yeah.
But what have we done here? We've drilled down to the simple business rule that we just had a discovery of in what sequence should they appear in. And we've also actually, in fact, this combines two things, which sometimes is good and sometimes isn't. It also combines the idea that we are eliminating duplicates. So the duplicates even though we had 6 inputs, our sorted and filtered display only has 4 of them. Okay. So what else could we do with this? Well, if we decided to change the reasoning and say that we wanted the most frequent suggestions to come first, well, then we simply change our suggestion list in the then and move the 70 and the second up to the first 2 lines. We're not going to do that, but that would simply say, okay, and we'd have a little note in our scenario with maybe a little more explanation of, we sort them by files, and then we also sort them and have the most frequent ones first, whatever you want. But notice why, if this is not a developer decision and how they appear, because this is actually seen to the exterior world and it affects the user. And so business rule like this is something that we really want to make sure that everybody understands. This is the sequence. It's always changeable, but it's a sequence and the ordering that we agreed upon, that this is the meaning of sorted, just like we agreed on what was the meaning of fast. Okay. Yep.
I'll give you back control.
All right. Okay. Looks good. All right. So just a few more notes on here. Let's see. All right. Going to do just a couple more notes and then take a break and come back for our next session. So here's our user interface. Almost everything on a user interface is typically a domain term. Anything you want to type into user interface, chances are that it actually represents a term that has some formatting, something else. And so that domain term that we had for Celsius, if you have a user interface item called temperature, that should have exactly the same validation as our domain term Celsius. We construct our validation once, and then we utilize it. Now, maybe it has to be a JavaScript validation because we're having it in the web. Maybe it's a C# because it's part of a program. Maybe it's a C# because it's the back server side implementation that's receiving the data. Doesn't matter. One test. And the beauty is, especially if you write in Gherkin, you only have one test to maintain. Then everybody goes, well, is that the test? That's the test. Now, how you automate it is going to change depending on JavaScript or C# or Java or anything else. But one test for that domain term, independent of the implementation. That's what we like to keep. And that user interface calls that validation. You don't have to test 400 values inside of temperature. You test 2, one that is good and one that is bad, and you test all the rest through your domain terms. And once again, unless it is absolutely critical that every single value needs to be tested. In fact, I was just on a note on that. There was one financial institution that you could have up to 8 co-owners of an account. And so they had their stuff and 8 co-owners. They tested it with 8. They tested it with 1 and 2 and 3. Things were working. 4, 5, 6, and 7 on enough. That should work. Then it worked for 4 in production. Tested it for every. Is that a critical thing that it worked for all 8? Yeah. So let's just test it with all 8. All right. Domain terms. Right. We really don't have any domain terms here, but what we'd like to do, let's take a look at, Jordan, do you have the feature file for the email address?
Let me see.
If not, we're going to make one up.
It doesn't look like I've got it in the Gherkin editor, but I might have it in Visual Studio.
No, let's just, we're just going to create one.
All right.
This will be, oh, except we're going to take a break first for 6 minutes, 7 minutes, because that's how long it takes for my coffee to redo. And we'll then come back and do a domain term. And we also have some other stuff for you. See you in 7.
Hello. Oh, Huntley.
Okay, so Jordan, you want to get share the editor.
Sure. Let me. So I did actually. Do you want me to show it? Because I copied and pasted out of the solution that we had before.
That's perfectly fine. Go ahead and do that.
There we go. Cool. There it is then.
Blow it up a little. Yeah. Oh, people don't want it blown up.
I'll do it. I'll do it one more for you.
Okay. So what we have here is a domain term called email address, a common domain term. Everybody uses it. Okay. And here's just our email address validation. Here's a value. And is it valid or not? So A at B.com, perfectly valid. A at B. Well, the domain has to have at least two parts to it. Of course, it used to be in the old days that it had to be a com or an edu or something. Now it can be almost like anything. So at least all we can test is it's got two parts. Line 10, it can't have two ats. You can't have a plus in the domain name side, but A plus Bill, perfectly fine, because you can have a plus in the name. In fact, that's used to do filtering sometimes. But since we're on this domain term, let me ask, since we have half the testers here, what other things would you like to check? What other, when you tested an email field, what other things you want to find out whether they're valid or invalid? Just type in the chat an email address and whether you consider it valid or not.
Emojis.
Well, I don't know if you can put that one in. Just put a colon in the yeah. So do it new. I put a colon parentheses in the name field, in the name part.
Colon parentheses like this.
Yeah. The other parentheses. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Which way do you do your smiley faces?
Oh, I see what you mean.
I'm sorry, we can't put emojis in here. And so I think that's false.
I would assume so.
And you could say the note would be emojis not allowed. Oh, the window escape characters. Oh man, we can't. You know, it's hard to type in a text box all of these things. Oh, a new one on line 14. We got to have let's see, Jordan at somewhere.co.uk.
Uh-huh.
And that should be true, right?
I would expect it to be.
I mean, and the difference is we can only test the formatting here, whether it's really valid or not. You actually have to send the email. Okay. Oh, and so forth. No characters should be invalid. Okay. Well, let's see. Okay, so if we just put a blank, yeah, and then that should be, yeah, false.
Let's maybe we'll just put like an empty string like this or something, or just literally leave it blank.
I tend to just leave it blank.
Okay.
You just okay. Windows. Yeah, it's hard to put an emoji picker into a text field like this. All right. Okay, so we have an app.com.
Okay.
And just have a .com. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you one more here, if I think I've got this right. Do a new line, do a curly brace, a left curly brace, a right curly brace, a at b.com. All right, and I'm going to ask before we put yes or no, does anybody know whether that is a valid email address or not? It is a valid, excuse me, it is a valid email address. And everybody probably is going to look going, what? If you actually look at the official document, there's called a RFC, request for comment document, that specifies valid email addresses. Those characters can appear in the name field. Now, why they can appear in the name field is a long story. And if you're in for a fireside chat one time, we can talk about all that. Okay, and we'll just do one more here. Fred, Jordan somewhere so just Jordan somewhere.co.uk is invalid. Okay, or false. Yeah. All right. We're not going to go through. Think of how many possibilities you would like to test. We got fred.domain.com. Oh, well, we've got at least fred.domain.com, somewhere.co.uk. So we've got something with three three parts to it. What's the limit on the number of parts in a domain name? Whatever it can fit. I think it's 128 characters long. So you could actually have 63 parts to a domain name, because the top level domain has to be at least 2 characters. We could spend the rest of this time just coming up with values here. And notice, from a testing standpoint, once it's already been automated to test 1 or 2 of them, you can test away. Okay. We could take this scenario, break it into 2 scenarios, put a tag on each one, and put, we'll call it some of the stuff in the first scenario, and then run 400,000 combinations in the second scenario. Okay, and so forth. Okay, so that's why I always suggest doing domain terms, because much of the testing, at least I'm going to call it validation of values, can be done simply by simply writing and saying this is valid, this is invalid. Dollars, social security number, identifiers, phone numbers, you name it. All right. Each one of those should have a scenario that has a domain term associated with it. If you run all of that stuff, you don't have to test that through a flow scenario. No reason to do that. Okay. So there's our domain terms. Now, just want to mention a few other things here. The stuff we've been working on are the functional tests. There are what I like to call the cross-functional tests, i.e. some people call them the non-functional tests. And I go, what do you mean non-functional? It's supposed to work that way. So performance and so forth. It's a non-functional test. No, it's a test that actually works across many things have to be performance. So I have I'll call it a little elaborate table here. You may have seen the testing matrix. It's a 4x4. One person, I can't remember at the moment, created a 2x3. And I said, why not? Let's do a 3x3 because everything keeps growing. So what have we been talking about so far here is those customer user tests. That's what BDD is, at least the main part. Do we have the right functionality? Do we agree on what that functionality is? Now, beneath here, we can have component tests. Some people use BDD as a test of the interfaces, i.e. Gherkin as a test of the interfaces. The parts underneath, perfectly fine. And then down at the bottom, we may have those unit tests written in the language of the implementation to test other things as well. So we've got all three levels of tests. An interesting part is that everybody said, you know, if you've got this test for an email address, do I need a unit test for it? Why? You've got a test. I don't care whether it's implemented in a single method, in a single class, or what have you. You have a behavior that tests a unit of behavior. Chances are you don't need a language, dependent test. Always an exception, but that's my main thing. Over here, we have the cross-functional test. Nothing we've done so far is testing it for usability. Who can test it for usability? Well, the users. Down here at the bottom, property testing, performance, secure. How do you test for security? Hire some hackers. Let them test. Or you can always test it for predetermined security. You just can't test it for all those other issues. Log4j, if you know what that means. Okay. And then finally, in between here is exploratory testing, i.e. the type where you're taking paths through the system or questioning your assumptions. And we'll talk about those momentarily. That you say, what happens if that assumption is not met? What happens if the user does this? And so forth. So what happens? In fact, my most common example of exploratory testing is when you see on the screen, you've just submitted an order and a little box comes up that says, do not press the back button. Do not, refresh this page. It's like, yeah, let's see what happens. Maybe I'll get it twice. Maybe I won't have to pay for it at all. I don't know. Hard telling, not knowing. And in this column in between here is what I call pre-specified things. i.e. for unit property testing, if we have a performance measurement that says we need to do 10,000 transactions a second, well, we can break that down and say it's got to be done in 10 milliseconds. Well, no, in 10 microseconds. We have to have your little unit has to work in 5 microseconds because we got other units that need to also contribute to that transaction. So we can start to specify some
performance at the unit level. Up at the top, pre-specified usability. God, you've got a corporate standard. Does your screens match that corporate standard? Right? You might have other things saying all pages should have to load in 2 seconds. Yeah, right. That used to be a standard. Now it's like, okay, all pages have to load in 2 minutes. And then in between there, pre-specified exploratory. Maybe you discovered something in the exploratory phase that you want to check on all systems. Oh, we've done this path. We realized that it came up with an odd but okay thing. We just want to make sure that same odd path works the same way in other things. So we could try this out. But let's just do this as a group in the chat. We've got a website that streams video. You all watch videos. What are your cross-functional requirements or tests for the video? Just put it in the chat. This is not this is a behavior, but it's a test of the cross-functional requirements. Does anybody have a requirement they'd like to have a video actually meet? Then it may not necessarily be specified as a given when then. Should never stop. Oh, it can be paused and resumed. Oh, I love it. Can rewind it. Oh, yeah. Okay. Can you control the playback speed? It should start in a couple of seconds. Buffering. Oh man, subtitles can be turned on if available. Okay. Okay. Mute on and off. Full screen can play. Oh, you want the video and a picture in a picture. Okay. Should not glitch. Minimum frame rate to maintain should be at least 15 frames per second. All right. Can be open in a separate window. Yeah. Full screen it. Oh man, you've got a lot of requirements. I'm going to give you just one more that I was thinking. It's like, will it, black and white should not be allowed? Oh, what if you're watching an old film? Oh, come on. The stuff that hasn't been colorized yet. Do you want it to automatically colorize? Should play on the piece of the string. Oh, that is my broadband, able to change resolution. Yeah, okay, so let me just hit that last one. Thank you for all you're great here. Okay. Resolution. Maybe our performance is, and it sort of goes along with performance, we have a limited bandwidth because everybody else is watching the last episode of Game of Thrones, so 98% of the bandwidth in this world is being used up. That maybe from a performance, a quality aspect, that it automatically reduces resolution so that it keeps playing. Oh, boy. So, I mean, I've seen movies and it's like, okay, I know I've got low bandwidth here, but the audio keeps going, the screen freezes for a moment, and then it catches up and does the next screen, and it's got low bandwidth, but it's trying its best. So I'm going to call it adaptive resolution and so forth. Okay, which also could be supported on a mobile or tablet. All right, so let's take a look. Thank you very much. Let's take a look at some process thoughts. Here's a requirement. Here is a testable requirement, and here's a developable requirement. How do I distinguish between these two? Well, a requirement is just a one-liner. And isn't necessarily should be schedulable because you don't have enough information to actually put an estimate on it. Maybe you're doing Kanban, so that doesn't matter quite as much. But then it's always nice to get at least a little high-level estimate. A testable requirement, at least one example for each test. Right? We did something for the email. Maybe we got just one or two valid and invalid. But then a developer requirement, all examples. Yeah, a developer can turn out something that passes through two tests, but if you really can't ship it until you have everything, then let's have all of the tests associated with this. Okay. So I suggest at the beginning, outside of the iteration, in your story prep, in your grooming, whatever you do, is to come out with what I call an outline. An outline of the test. Just one example, doesn't have to give all the details. And maybe it's only just a simple given when then without a lot of data. And then when you pull it off the backlog, then you're going to write all the scenarios for all the tests because you're writing the requirements. Developer binds it to the production code. They're the ones who are going to create the production code, so then they know the name of the method or how they're going to operate. And then during coding, we keep running the tests until they pass. Now, possibly, you might outline and write all the tests during the previous iteration. And then bind them and run them. Oh man, that's a lot of look ahead. Why would I do that? Well, if you get in trouble when you pull a story off the backlog and you start writing all the tests, you realize this is not a one-day story. This is like a 3-week story. And somebody says, hey, you estimated this wrong. Well, the more information we have, which is the number of tests, just like we did with the temperature, Jordan had to go from a few seconds to a few hours because we had more tests. The more tests that we have, the better our estimate could be. If we have a simple test, pretty quick. If we've got a test that has 12 variations, 100 variations, take that email address thing. We had 1,000 variations we wanted to test it. Chances are it's going to take a while. So, last little part is assumptions. An assumption, a statement about what you consider to be true. Now, there's a couple of things you can do with assumption. You can ignore them. You can just say, yep, that's what it is. I'm going to do all of my behavior without worrying about it. Well, maybe you want to check them. Maybe you want to make sure that they're true. And if they're not true, then you don't go onward. Oh, we assume that we always have the internet. Aha. An application that does that and crashes because of that, probably not a good one. But an application, we say we assume we have the internet. We're going to check whether we have the internet. And if we don't, we're going to report back, sorry, no more progress. At least we don't crash. Okay. And now, if you actually deal with a false side, then you have another test thing you need to do. You need to disconnect the internet and check that the response of the application responds with the appropriate message. Okay. All right. During our discovery and formulation, Jordan, do you remember what assumptions we made?
We made one. And
was?
that was all files are from the same project.
All files are for the same project. Okay. Because we're doing our matching, we're matching against all the files of the user. Straightforward. And we assume that they're all from the same project. Now, if that's not the case, well, do we have any way of telling that? Well, as you, Jordan, any way that we could tell that they're not from the same project?
No, not currently.
Not currently.
No.
So that's an assumption you really can't test. And if we decide that that's an important thing to be able to do matching from different projects, well, now we go through and we start the whole process again. Should we have folders? Should people have a different logon for a different project with their own folders, and so forth and so on? Okay. You might have lots of assumptions that you found. All right, so just a couple of extras. Oh, no, we'll skip over these here. Automation. Actually, nah, that's okay. Automation. We're going to automate one of those business rules and those domain terms. And Jordan, if you would take it away and show the automation of the email.
Sure. Do you want to do the email or the step matching?
Either one, whichever
Either
you
one.
like.
Okay. Let me share. I'll do the step matching just because it's I feel like it fits into the context of what we were talking about. So this is the same feature file that we saw in the Gherkin editor to begin with before we did any modification. So this is the how it looks today. And simply, so we're not doing any Selenium UI testing or anything like this. We're actually testing directly against not the real Gherkin editor, obviously, because that's a closed source project, but we've mimicked what the Gherkin editor does effectively in the code. So imagine this automation project lived inside of the Gherkin editor project. We would have direct access to its working components. And as Ken mentioned earlier, we can directly test those components that the UI will be using to do the same validation too. So that's what we've mimicked here. So we've got our test. Let me just give this a quick build. Oh, it's already here. So let's see. We've got the same set of 7 tests, and I won't go through the implementation of the mimicking of the Gherkin editor just because it's not that straightforward. It uses the Gherkin parser and things like this. But if we give these a quick run, we should hopefully see that they're all green, and they are, which is super cool. Let me just quickly dive into the steps. So this is what the step definition looks like. And as I said, I'm not going to dive too much into the implementation for the auto-completion stuff. But we are just mocking that stuff so we can test it directly from our feature file, which is pretty cool. And as Ken mentioned, we had something similar before with the checking of the valid email address, and we simply had the domain term that we saw inside of the online Gherkin editor inside of Visual Studio, and we matched all of those values to or we ran it through the same email address matching validation that we have online, and we directly interacted with that component, so we didn't have to do that awkward, clumsy Selenium testing through the UI. We could just test the component directly from inside the same project. So was that okay, Ken?
Yeah. So in other words, just to summarize here, we made all those tests up for the behavior. And that's how you'd see it from the UI standpoint. But that doesn't mean we can't use exactly those same tests against an API that implements all that stuff. So we always think of our scenarios as being external behavior, but just like the domain terms and anything else, we can use that exact same scenario against APIs, methods here and over. So notice that in fact, for most of this stuff, it was simply the implementation was just a 1 or 2 line call to an existing API structure that did this stuff. So it's not just for external tests, it can be used for internal tests as well. Do you have the email or not?
I do. Give me a second and I will find it.
Okay.
It will take me just a moment. Here it is. I've got it.
Okay.
Just loading it now. Give me a second. Come on, Visual Studio, don't let me down. Dev spec laptop, yeah. Cool. So let me quickly whip into where am I? Features in here, and this is the create account feature. Come on, load. And you'll see the this same domain term email address that we had before. So we're just passing in this table, and if we go to the implementation when it finishes, I'll just navigate to it directly. You can see that we have this email address validator. Again, it's not the real one, of course, it's just some mock stuff, and we're passing it in the value, and then we're basically checking whether we get a valid result back from the validator. So if we have a look in here, you can see there's quite a crude implementation for mocking the checking of this email address, but just know that this is just to stand in for that component, and just to show you that it doesn't have to be an external component. As Ken mentioned, you can directly test your internal components that your other bits of the application might be consuming as well.
So just leave this up for a moment.
Yeah.
You can write your domain terms and your business rules as a standard given when then. But notice here was this email validation that only had a single step to it, and it passed the table in. So in our email address validation, it gets a table or enumerable, and it does a loop inside to validate each one of those. Okay. It's going to run a little faster than having 3 separate steps. But notice one thing. Notice that is a public static method. A public static method. It does not depend on the test itself. It does not depend on anything else in that class. That makes it a purely functional, stateless thing. What we'd like to do with our business rules and everything is to make them stateless, i.e. only pass in the information they need, get the information back out, and all of your business rule and your domain terms test will simply have this loop to them. And because we can, in fact, Visual Studio will suggest that you make that a static method because it doesn't access any instance variables or any member variables. That means it's a perfect, stateless, functional, in the terms of functional programming, all of the inputs go into the method and come out of the method with 0 side effects or gathering anything else. That's just why, that just shows why I tend to use a single step def for a single step
for business rules as opposed to having given, when, then for each of those. Okay. We're not going to have, we could, let's see, how are we doing on time? I have more stuff in here than 11:11. Okay. Let me go through this just briefly, and then I've got a few other things. So we'll go past a little bit past 11:30. We're actually supposed to go to 12. So let me just talk about events, responses, and states here. Because an event is an occurrence. This is the reason I give this is that in many cases in your domain, we've got a lot of given, when, thens. Okay, where we have a given a state. When we do something, then we go to a new state. And these can all be separate sort of scenarios. And sometimes it's hard to track all these states and where they're going if they're simply in separate places. Okay. Right. So an event is an occurrence. That's something the user initiated, or maybe it's something that the hardware said, it's time to do this, or maybe it's the first time of the month. Maybe you do it every hour. So it's something that is occurring. Either the user's clicked or a timer has gone off. And the event response table lists events and responses. So here is an event for our report conversion. There's not much to it, but we have a report. The report is received. The system initiated that. The report is converted. The system says, I've finished my processing. We're done. Oh, there's an event called temperature measure change. The human went in and changed the configuration file. And now you might have events that actually have no bearing. But if you're thinking about events like Chicken Little announces the sky is falling, should our application respond to that event or not? Maybe, maybe not. So events are things that occur. And then we have a state transition diagram that given we're in a particular state, when an event occurs, we go to another state. Or if we're in a different state, we go to maybe a different state. And perhaps we're in state 1 and this event 2 occurs. Well, that should never have happened. We weren't in a state where that should have occurred. And if event 2 occurs, we simply go back to state 1. So maybe events, we stay in the same state, maybe we go to a different state, or maybe we say, that could never possibly happen. So given our current state, when an event occurs, then we get a new state. And every box is filled in with either a new state or not applicable. So we have an initial state where we start out in, and we have a terminal state, which is we're never going to get out of there. We have no transitions out of it. So let's just give an example, a quick example here. Here we have a report received. That's our initial state. We just got into it. The system converts the temperatures, and then we go to report has been converted. We're in the report converted state. The system sends the report, and we go into the report has been sent. Well, that's the end. Okay, we can't go into any other state. We finished the report. It's all done. But suppose we had an error in conversion when we do the report. So it wasn't that it was converted, that we had an error. Well, then we go into an error state. Should we go out of there or not?
notice that when our report has been sent, we're not going, any event won't cause us to change anything because we've been done with it. The error, should we go into another state? Should maybe we go into a manual correction state? So if we're in a manual correction state and our event is we have corrected the report, then we could go into a report received again. Basically, here is a state diagram that documents the transitions between all those states, and each one of these transitions is going to be a scenario, a given, when, then. So we have a test for every of those. Given the temperature measure is set, when the report is received, then the report is output. That's our transition at the high level. All right, we're not going to do this one. We don't have any states, if you will, in this particular thing. Well, let's just summarize a little bit. Why do we do BDD ATDD? Well, if we looked at the flow of development, we decide we're going to do something. We then analyze it to get some details. We do a little design, we do some coding, we do some testing, we deploy it, and then we execute it in production. Now, maybe you got a few loops in here and so forth. So this is straightforward because maybe from the coding, you figure out your design and maybe you're doing some testing during the coding and so forth. But without ATDD, BDD, what happens? Instead of getting a direct flow, we get those defects. We go from test back to coding. An error. We go from test back to analyze because we realize in testing we didn't understand the requirement well. That was a little ambiguous and the developer read it one way, the tester read it another, and then we got to go back to the product owner to say, what really did you mean? And the worst is if you have to go from the in production back to analyze, because it's like, oh, we missed something here. All of those things take time because of misunderstandings, missed requirements, missed anything else. So what do we want to do? We want to have feedback to correct those understandings. And the quicker we get the feedback, well, it's better than slow feedback. It's going to take us longer to correct that. So if we have quick, slow feedback, what is delivered is far away from what's actually desired. But if we have quick feedback, what is desired and what is actually delivered are going to be pretty close together. So how do we get some of this quick feedback? Well, we decide we're going to do something. We analyze it with tests. We detail the requirements with the scenarios. And who does that? The triad. Everybody's agreeing on what it should be. We replace that misunderstanding with shared understanding. Okay. Temperature. How many decimal digits do we want to round up, round down? All of that. Then we design with the test to make our design testable, to make sure that it's testable. We code with the test. We make sure that our code passes all the tests we've agreed with. Now, we still may have to do a little testing. You put all things together, you still need to do a little performance testing. Maybe you need to run some security scans on it, whatever. So we are never getting rid of everything. Then we deploy it with the test. We actually test in our deployment stages and then in production. And sometimes we can actually run tests in production. So we've taken care of most of those unnecessary loopbacks. Moving our tests first. So how does it work with internal tests? Well, at the external world, we have our triad, developer, tester, and customer, deciding on what the behavior should be, the external behavior. And then inside, we have all these components.
classes, functions, methods, APIs, you name it. And that's the internal behavior that in its composite produces the external behavior. Now, in some cases, it's a 1-for-1, like with business rules. And sometimes our developers teams needs to do design, code, and testing in a sequence as they desire to produce the components that produce the external behavior. That's how it all fits together. External visible behavior, internal behavior that produces the external behavior. So this is not an ending, but a beginning. Here's what one team, 4 months after I taught them ATDD, said. The team happiness factor increased. Specifically, the lead developer and tester are much happier. Less stress on the testers. Why? Because testing was distributed all across the sprint rather than 4 o'clock on the afternoon before the iteration of sprint ended. Not that that ever happens. Help create a we are the team feeling. Everybody was contributing. Fewer production defects, fewer test environment defects, less rework due to miscommunication. And that flow was going. So what are the objectives here? Given these were the objectives, experience BDD, ATDD, understand the shades of Gherkin, and appreciate how it benefits the team. When now we've completed this session, and we still are going to have some Q&A here, we want to check that these objectives were met. So ask any questions in our Q&A. And let me just give you my resources. Here's my a few links. acceptance-test-driven-development.com has some information on ATDD. You can write to me, ken@kenpugh.com. Connect with me on LinkedIn at Ken Pugh. I got in early enough. I don't have to put a number after it. And go to my website. So let's go for questions.
Do you want me to read them to you, or there's only one actually?
There's only one. Okay.
There's only one. So I'd say anyone that's got any burning questions for Ken, do let us know. Because now's your opportunity to speak to him directly. So the only one question we have is from Alexander, and his question is, how can we automate scenario order of suggestions from UI, from a UI automation standpoint? So I guess their question is about the technical implementations of trying to automate the suggestions from the UI, getting access to the suggestions, I guess via Selenium. It's tricky.
Okay. You just answered it. Selenium. Okay. So what one way to do this, if you notice that, so we have our background, and from the standpoint of the UI, well, that background happens to be exactly what comes up. So do you have a file that you can use that load up that has that background in it? Great. So you click the appropriate things to load that file up. If not, maybe your action is clear out what's ever in there and stick that data in. Okay. Now, using Selenium, you're going to type a word, and they don't give you suggestions just as you type a character. You actually have the word to end with a space. So enter those characters in to the edit box, and then you'll be looking for the drop down, the selection list that should be generated. Okay.
I think if I could add to that, Ken.
Yeah.
So I think another key point to being successfully be able to automate these types of complex scenarios is you have to build the UI with testing in mind, right? You have to build it in a way that you can easily hook into these things using, these tools and APIs. So that's a key thing, because I can tell you now, the way it currently stands, it wouldn't be easy to automate. So it's important that you think about those things too through development.
Yes, thanks for that point. So one of the things, okay, how do you find these elements? I mean, some places make it, I'm going to call it the standard in building a UI, that every element on the page has a unique ID. So you don't have to go traipsing your way through the hierarchy of things. You can simply, your edit box has a unique ID and it does not change. And so that your Selenium, you don't have to worry about as much. That's at least the way that some places do it. And it's therefore then, in fact, I was at one place, and this was several years ago, is that the automation people and the UI people got together and they agreed that these were the IDs for the parts on our prototype, i.e. you just had sort of a paper prototype. And then the automation people actually developed some automation. UI people developed it, came together, they had agreed on the interface, and things actually worked the first time, which is not guaranteed, but it's because you've made that, I'll call it the domain term decision as to what to identify each of the GUI parts.
Cool, thanks, Ken. So looks like there might be some continuation of that question from somebody else. And it says, do we need to test an invalid domain term or the definition is enough?
Oh, okay. So if I've got my domain term like email and it says that it's invalid, I've already tested to make sure that I can test for something invalid. Now the question is, if I have an invalid domain term, what should be my response? Well, if it's on an entry screen, I want to check for a response that says invalid email. Oh man, how do they do that? You do that with the line at the top. You do that with a fence. Now we're talking about what I call display rules. And so then you've got sometimes to automate this becomes a little more difficult because you have so many variations, but it's basically, given I have an invalid email address, my display should show something. Will it show it as I blur off the field? Will it show it when I hit the submit button and I get a message up above? Will I show it like that? We could have at least start with a manual description of what you want, we could check, and then automate it later. Suppose my email address is coming in a data. Okay, so hopefully I've prevented invalid email addresses, at least format wise, from getting into the system. And then of course, the only way I can really verify it is actually try and send an email, a separate thing. But let's say the email address was coming in a file or some thing that you didn't have control over. What should you do? You read in, you've just gotten contact information passed to you from another system. It's got an invalid email address. Mr. Product Owner, what should we do? Should we
run away?
What?
Run away.
Throw it away. Yeah. Make it, erase it, make it invalid. Look, and everybody goes, yeah, that's a developer decision. No. Getting rid of a piece of business data is not a developer decision. Now, maybe the developer can give alternatives what to do with it and go, well, let's see if we can auto-correct it. That'd probably be hard on the email address. But what do you want us to do with it? Throw away that record? Mark it as we're going to have a problem. The next time the user logs on, we're going to ask him for his email address, even though he logged on with an incorrect one. But then it's like, why didn't we verify this email address and so forth? So that's why we separate out the business rules for validating from then the actions we take. Separation of concerns makes for easier concerns. One place to validate, and then we need to have separate scenarios on, are we doing the right thing with those invalid stuff?
Cool, thanks, Ken. Next question is from Roberto. What's your recommendation when trying to write the gherkin for a legacy system that is lacking test and documentation?
I've never heard of that. I thought all legacy systems came. No, let's see. Actually, that's Michael Feather's as definition. A legacy system is any system that does not have tests written for it. Whoa, which means there are systems that were written 40 years ago that are not legacy because they do have tests written for it. And there are systems that were just written last week that are legacy because they don't have tests written for it. All right, so here is my suggestion on this. You never know where to start. So I always start with, let us assume the legacy system is working as it should be. And of course, maybe it isn't. We can't apply tests to everything because that would take us about 1.5 years probably. Okay. And what I suggest is you have a story. You have a little bit of stuff. One little story around something. Write a test for whatever it is you're changing. First, write a test for how it exists now, and then write the test for how it should be afterwards. You run the test against the existing system, it should pass. Your other test should fail. Now, you make the changes, the old test should fail, the new test should pass. Unfortunately, many legacy systems are not designed to be able to access the lower layers. In fact, that is probably the primary reason why they are legacy. If it had been nicely constructed and I had something here I could call to do this operation, something here and something here, well, that's where I'm going to write my stuff to, rather than having to write through the UI. Right? Writing tests other than a nice flow test through the UI and having to test is, I'll call it, difficult. To have to test a business rule through the UI that we could have tested at the lower level much faster, much easier. Well, that's how we'd like to do it. But that's the problem with legacy systems, is they weren't designed, but we still just only start writing the test for just a little part that we have. Now, ideally, at least on the legacy system, and it all depends how big it is, that you can at least be able to wrapper it with some test doubles. In fact, okay, I normally don't promote products here, but we are part of Tricentis. I'm not part of Tricentis, but SpecFlow is. And some of the stuff that Tricentis has allows you to automatically create those test doubles around existing systems and report things back. So that is an alternative. They won't be able to directly address code that was not substantiated, but they'd at least be able to handle those external pieces there for you. Okay.
Thanks, Ken. The next question then is, how do you properly automate for more types of drivers, like for the UI or for an API? Should I combine those or make them in separate automation projects?
Okay, so we want to automate APIs and we want to automate a UI. And I'm presuming it's for the same project.
I would make that assumption.
Okay. I mean, obviously, it's going to be part of the same project. The question is whether you want to have your feature files separate, which in fact, in separate folders or something like that. I would suggest you've got two ways you can organize things. You have a feature, and then within this, I'm going to call it a folder, which represents a feature. You have all of this stuff in that folder that represents both the display, the UI test, and the API tests. And then for the another feature, we have display and UI test. Or do you switch it around? You have a folder that contains UI test with here's feature A, B, and C within it. And here is all the API tests with feature A, B, and C in it. Okay, two ways of what I call the spreadsheet conundrum. How do you hierarchical things that make a hierarchy out of something that is inherently a table? I'm going to say the answer is it depends. I would suggest that if your UI tests and your API tests tend to be cohesive, i.e. they deal with the same sort of functionality, it's just at two different levels, I'd organize it by the feature. But if your APIs are like, okay, in order to do this functionality in the UI, I have to call 12 different APIs, then I'd organize APIs over here and display in a separate thing.
Cool, thank you. Next question then is always a good one. Who writes gherkin and step definitions, the tester, the product owner, or the developer?
Okay, we're gonna have to step back to the first few slides on yesterday. They all do. The whole purpose of this collaboration is to have the product owner, the tester, and developer work on the gherkin together. All right. Now, sometimes your product owner isn't completely available because they're tied up. So then at least we have the developer and tester write the gherkin. And then check it with the product owner and say, did we get it right? If the product owner doesn't understand your gherkin, then you have a problem because there's no way that we can now communicate that we're actually on the same page. So in fact, when we're writing gherkin, my rule is the product owner is the final copy editor. If the product owner doesn't like the way it's written, developer and tester defer to them because we need to have it in their terminology, not in ours. So it may be that a tester goes off, and now that you've written the standards, if you will, like take the business rule for temperature, it's okay for a tester to go off and write some more examples of stuff. And then chances are they probably want to go back to the developer and say, here's why I'm giving you all this other, I've got this scenario that has 482 different combinations in there. Developer says, great, I don't have to write a unit test for this. I love that. Okay, I'm just going to make sure it passes all of that stuff. And if I have an issue, we're going to get together, tester and developer, and go, was that a wrong answer that you put, an output, or is there something I still don't understand? Chances are a product owner will not have the time nor the inclination to look through every single variation that a tester came up with. I don't expect that. So the triad together to do the sufficient examples for understanding. If you come up with some new stuff that requires some input from the product owner, good, as the developer and tester. And if the tester, comes up with some stuff as they're developing the 400 examples, maybe that one example you bring back to the product owner. But we start with all three. Why not? You're all responsible for quality.
Good, thanks, Ken. And then there's one more from Martin. and I'll summarize it a bit. Your step definitions are very brief. Instead of having more elaborate sentences, for example, we've said when typing instead of when the user types. Would you always use brief step definitions, or which context would be fitting for more sentence-like definitions?
Ah, interesting. Yes, okay. I tend to be a little briefer because most of the data is actually in the tables. Okay. I'm going to call it, there are two different shades of gherkin here. I'm going to call it the, let's see, what would a term be? I'll call it the full sentence style, and I'm going to call it the phrase style. Okay, and as you noted, I tend to be a phrase style. Okay. And here's the rule, if the product owner likes to see sentences, then we'll use sentences. If they're happy with going, oh, of course the user is typing it. Who else would be typing it? You've now just written a sentence out, and it's like, I don't need to know that. I'm familiar enough with this product. It's obvious who's typing it. Then go with the phrases. Okay. In fact, I had the original thing on context. If we have a context for a story that this is what the user is doing, then do we always need to be referencing who is doing this action? Maybe, maybe not. So I tend to say, here, this is what my user's doing. They're typing. Who else would be typing? Well, okay, if you had a robot typing, I might say the robot's doing it, but they're actually a user as well. But my rule is product owner wins. Often, sometimes, I've noticed that, and I'll call it, now this is my personal observation, I have noticed two-step tests that are only like one word in difference. And in reading stuff, I tend to just sort of like look at things. It's like, just sort of, I don't read everything perfectly. I just sort of go, oh yeah, that's it. And if I have two-step tests that are really two different things, but there's just one wording change different, and they really mean something else, well, I find that harder to maintain. I tend, and this is just my personal preference, is that the data shows the differences. And if I need that extra context, I put a notes column right next to it. Doesn't, it's perfectly usable. It's actually gets read in to this step. You could actually put it out in a comment or an assertion if you wish. So that's my style. But the product owner wins. Whoever the product owner, whichever way they want to do it. So.
Cool. That was the last one. So in terms of questions, we are all good. Let me just check, see if there isn't any chucked in the chat that we can pick up on. No, it's all good. Cool. Then I guess that concludes the Q&A.
All right. Well then, contact me. I think Katrina's going to put a link on here. And so
we will also share we'll share all the links and everything in the follow-up email, so you can get hold of Ken.
I will also put the links in the chat. And so Ken provides, as he mentioned, his own trainings, and we have 2 exclusive offers for SpecFlow users, a 2-day team training and up to 2 hours triad coaching. Please check the link and book Ken's training. And also I'd like to draw your attention to our Community Hero program. So the idea is that you can get $25 Amazon voucher from us by sending us your contributions. And it can be a GitHub contribution, video contribution, articles. We'll review it and we will select the best contributions and send you vouchers and also feature you on our website and social media. And thank you for joining today's webinar. Please follow us on social media and have a nice day.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
See you next time.
Bye.
Mm.